Welcome back to the Digital Void Virtual Salon series. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Mitch Horowitz. Mitch is a historian of alternative spirituality and one of today's most literate voices of esoterica, mysticism, and the occult. Mitch is a 2020 writer-in-residence at the New York Public Library, lecturer-in-residence at the Philosophical Research Society in Los Angeles, and the PEN Award-winning author of books including Occult America, One Simple Idea, How Positive Thinking Reshaped Modern Life, and The Miracle Club. Joining Mitch in conversation is Dr. Jamie Cohen, digital media culture expert and co-host of The Digital Void. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to have you here tonight. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Josh. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. That's wonderful. Thank you. And thank you, Mitch, for taking the time with us tonight. It's really awesome to speak with you. As Josh and I were talking to you before the show, Digital Void was really based on a conceptualization of connecting and thinking things through and making things happen together in a very synchronistic way. And so that's why we came up with the void, the circle. And so our project is about bringing ideas to the public through this platform and just having discussions with really amazing people and really amazing thinkers. So that's what we're glad you're here tonight. So thank you again.
Pleasure. Thank you.
So I want to start off with just a few observational questions I've had. I've read most of all of your work, and Josh and I have really studied it and really talked about it. But I want to start back a little bit. Back in, I just want to know your thoughts on some of the most recent events. But first, I want to frame it in the sense of back in 2016, after the election, there's a bit of a shift in the way that we started thinking about how our mental health would be worked with or considered in this time, in this rough time. And I noticed that these mind gyms had started opening up in New York City, like these places that you could pay to sit and think. And I wanted to know, based on your work and how you've done the studies you've done and the work you've actually written, what do you think of those? What do you think about the moment and how the politics of that time affected people so much that they wanted to express those feelings in a place where they paid to sit? How do we center that idea?
It's an interesting question. I've never personally visited one of those mind gyms, so I'm not able to speak from experience, but I suppose my experience has been one of indifference to them as an individual. It's not something that I personally want to go and seek out. I suppose there's a degree to which every experience becomes so commodified that you feel as if everything you've done in your life at one point or another is going to get sold back to you, including slang expressions, music, humor, anger. Anger gets sold back to us. I mean, anger is the biggest commodity on Twitter. If it weren't for bickering and insulting one another, often anonymously, Twitter wouldn't exist. So isn't it interesting? We see the actual commodification of anger, and it would seem to be strange. You might say, well, gee, I don't like getting angry, but look again. Anger is a tremendous adrenal rush. Anger gives people a temporary feeling of power. Anger is in some regards an act of violence, emotional violence, not physical violence. And people enjoy something about it. There's a roller coaster-like quality to it. So I'm always watching very carefully for when our experiences get sold back to us. Now, apropos of these mind gyms, my way of taking a break in the midst of the day is usually to nap. I've gone through periods where I've meditated. I've gone through periods where I've napped. And I used to just literally throw out like a Zafu mat on the floor of my office back when I had an office, when I worked in publishing, which I no longer do. And I would just go to sleep. I had a friend who used to work at Bloomberg Businessweek magazine, and he worked in a newsroom atmosphere where you're just seated at a desk in sort of an open source office, so-called. And he would just put his head down on the desk and go to sleep and hope that the big boss man, Bloomberg, wouldn't walk by and ask, why are you sleeping? But the fact is, so many things that are sold back to us we can do on our own. Not everything. But I do try to watch real carefully for the manner in which we start to subscribe to or pay for things that we can do on our own, including anger, which most people seem to have no problem doing on their own. But now we've made it into a multi-billion-dollar business on Twitter.
Well, I think that's absolutely cogent. I think your observation of Twitter is incredible. I think anger is one of those data points that's actually really quantizable more than other data points. I think it's not ambiguous in many ways. It's kind of like we know where it's directed. And so it is interesting to do that. I think I went to those mind gyms for quite some time. I was going through a really rough spot, and I was like, okay, well, this is kind of like the tool that was coming up. And it started showing up on the cover of all these magazines too. And then I started thinking about, well, I don't think it has as much to do with the paying for that process as much as it's like, as I have to start doing that myself. Like, and it's almost like a tool set. I actually learned how to do it. So then I was like, well, why am I paying? That becomes unnecessary. And then you start realizing that one-to-one transaction of internet media and digital media, we don't pay for those products. We don't pay for Twitter. And in doing so, we are the product. So it's
Absolutely.
like we're giving that out to the world. So how do we find ourselves inside of that knowledge if we're not really sure that if you don't pay for it, we're the product? How do we regain that agency?
Well, that's a wonderful observation. We are indeed the product. And I try to remind people that every time you insult somebody on Twitter, every time you throw mud at somebody on Twitter, you are becoming the product that they are selling back to people. You are part of the anger economy. And I think it's an illusion to imagine that putting out that kind of anger and negativity constantly, all day long, every third comment being sarcastic or caustic or something, has no effect on the individual. I feel very strongly that has an effect on the individual. Many, many years ago, people used to talk about what was called autosuggestion, the idea that you could repeat certain affirmations to yourself, and if repeated frequently enough, they would retone or recondition or color your character. I absolutely believe that's true, and I think in our own generation, we've seen placebo studies and cognitive studies and other things that have demonstrated the absolute truth of that. There's also a kind of autosuggestion occurring when we direct sarcastic or hostile comments at other people. It's not a consequence-free situation. And I think gossip, for example, I would say is not a consequence-free situation. Debasing other people is not a consequence-free situation. Any more than physical violence itself is not consequence-free. So I would ask people that if they want to feel a greater sense of self-possession, if they want to feel a greater sense of nobility, of dignity, frankly, words that I believe are underused in our time, start by desisting from smearing and gossip and just taking cheap shots at people. It doesn't mean you don't express your point of view. It doesn't mean you don't have a strong point of view. And it doesn't mean that you're not entitled to express anger about injustice. But it's these tiresome, sarcastic comments that just are these drive-by acts of hostility that could easily enough be avoided. My contention, based partly on the whole autosuggestive thesis, is that, and there's also an ethical dimension as well, you will stand taller. You will stand taller. And within a single hour, if you desist from that kind of habitual chronic anger mongering.
Yeah. There's a problem with digital media itself of this algorithmic direction into it. Like, I think your anger currency, the anger economy, is an incredible way of putting that. Because that's about those data points of how much time we spend on these things.
Yes.
And being bigger, being better, and like understanding or taking a breath and taking a step back is really recognizing like we have that control. We don't have to be on these machines. That makes me start thinking about this current moment. You know, it's like there's a lot of pain going on right now. Like there's an ache, I would put it, almost like a bone ache. This deep, we're seeing hostility, and we're seeing the problems that America has always faced from the time it was incepted to now. And now we're seeing it being exhibited in these very almost like explosive moments that we're watching on the street. And the reaction to them, the militarized police and the actions against it, doesn't just hurt the person who's on the street, but hurts the people that are at home too. How are we able to start thinking about being a good agent or a civic agent in that space, but also remaining that a place where we remove that ache, or maybe we give to somebody else who is aching differently? How do we use, I guess the best way is, how do I use that privilege to give to somebody who might be in that situation that can't get rid of that ache that I might feel?
Well, it's hard for me personally to speak about macro solutions.
Sure.
I don't have a lot of experience with macro solutions. I look out in the world, I participate in the world, I see the exact things you've just described, and I could describe all the contributing factors, as could probably most of your viewers and listeners. You know, we could all rattle off, you know, the unanswered calls of Black Lives Matter, COVID, the lockdown, lack of government support during the lockdown, that wonderful, wonderful man who's in the White House, and all these things that create a terrible pressure cooker situation. And So the causes, I think, are apparent to all of us. The solutions are going to have to be macro in nature. Of course, they're going to have to be constructive policies, real policies, things that make a difference in people's lives. Whether or not we as an individual nation possess the civic will to do that, I do not know. Whether or not we as a nation even possess at this moment the political vehicles to do that, I do not know. It's people experience difficulty in voting, and that is a terrible stain on our system. That is a terrible detraction from American democracy, and that's just one of many problems. So I'm not entirely sure we even possess the vehicles in terms of how to behave toward another person, how to deal with the pain that you feel, how to deal perhaps with the pain that another individual feels. I do think that while human nature has not changed, social media has debased us.
Yes.
And I personally think it's extremely damaging to the individual to use an anonymous handle on social media, or, whatever, you name it, Twitter, YouTube, what have you, and to debase other people. And I think that it engenders not only hostility in other people, but it amps up hostility in oneself. And the fact is, most of our lives today, most of our business lives, most of our civic lives, most of our political lives are online, apropos of what we're doing right now. This is a prime example. And I think that our generation is conscripted to relearn the lessons that maybe an agrarian generation had to learn many, many years before us, which is many folk who came from the agrarian experience didn't really know how to adjust to life in more crowded cities, industrial areas, offices, things like that. It wasn't any ethical failing, it was just different. And today, I would say actually it is an ethical failing on our part, our generation's part. We don't know how to live with anonymity,
right,
and the kind of sense of disinhibition that gives us, how to live with a 24/7 media platform where you can be in touch with people literally all over the world instantly, how to live with the fact that we can be broadcasting our opinions all day, every day, and constantly, how to live with the fact that we now, certainly for the first time in my life, have completely segmented media. So that if you think one way, you can watch Fox all day long and you'll encounter absolutely nothing that you'll have to disagree with. If you think another way, you can watch something else, MSNBC or NPR, or what have you. And so we're living with this segmented society, an anonymous society, a society that's digitally disinhibited, an ability to broadcast our opinions constantly, and we don't know how to do it. Every lesson about civility that previous generations learned must be relearned by us. And eventually we're going to come around to that, or we will fall apart.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on this a lot. This is my research, and I think what you've said is extremely important, because the granular nature of digital media is kind of different entirely. There is no real analog to the environment we have on Twitter. It's being a digital environment that's ecosystem based, like what you're talking about. You watch Fox News and literally never see another point of view. Occasionally a rare dissent.
Right.
But for the most part, you're hearing exactly the echo chamber. And then with Twitter, we each live in our own different feeds. If you're not curating a feed that's going to have an extended points of view, you're not seeing it. It just simply isn't there. It's invisible.
Right.
And to the point of I have a term for it, like the reactionaries. People
yes,
who
absolutely.
Reaction.
And if I may,
please,
it occurs. I mean, I'm not comparing, one to the other. I mean, I feel Trump has visited a grave crisis on our nation that we may not be able to recover from. Yeah. So I don't want to give anybody the misimpression that I'm saying, well, both sides have to be nice to one another. I think it's much more complicated than that. But I would also say that it's important not to think that just one side is possessed of all the problems and the other of all the answers. I think that the what was your phrase? I'm sorry, the reactionaries.
People
the reactionaries. I mean, today, for example, I shared a tweet that showed the prosperity minister, Joel Osteen, at a Black Lives Matter protest. Mm-hmm. Now, I do not hate Joel. I don't think he's the smiley face cipher that he's been depicted to be.
Sure.
He's not my go-to guy. He's not my main man, but I don't hate the guy. And I think that a lot of people within the media misunderstand that within mainstream evangelism, by which I mean massive media ministries, prosperity ministries, and churches of all different sizes that hold to the core evangelical principle that the purpose, the mission of Christianity is salvation, is repentance and salvation. There's a lot of different expressions within that, but if you check out that mainstream culture, it's enormous, and there is a political continuum within it. There absolutely is. And you've got people like Joel Osteen and T.D. Jakes and even the late Oral Roberts, who were not nearly as politicized as figures like Jerry Falwell Jr. and Benny Hinn and Jim Baker today. Jim Baker used to be not so bad. Now he's decided he, wants to join those guys. And but if I post a tweet saying, well, Joel did something today that wasn't terrible, he joined a Black Lives Matter protest, which I think it's important to recognize.
I think you're right.
Some people dig that, and some people react against that who have never listened to a Joel Osteen sermon, who have never read a Joel Osteen book. I'm not saying you're going to like what you encounter, but it might be helpful to realize that some of these people who are on the more apolitical end of that spectrum say things and do things that the individual who thinks that he hates them might discover he doesn't really hate them if he would just get down with some of not only specifically what they're saying, but the fact that they are hated. Some of the figures I just mentioned are hated. This also includes Norman Vincent Peale, who is himself very conservative politically, but they are hated by people who are on the right wing of evangelism because of their apolitical stance. Their apolitical stance, Osteen's refusal to denounce gays, his refusal to say that people who are non-Christian are going to hell, his categorical refusal to do all those things attracts the hatred and ire of other people within the evangelical movement, including Benny Hinn, for example, who has an enormous ministry. So forgive me for the tangent, but the point I'm trying to make is just that those of us who are on the more progressive side of the spectrum need to understand that there are these gradations on within more traditional conservative culture. That's not a reason to feel happy or to feel relaxed, and that doesn't detract in the slightest from the abomination that Trump is. But it is important to note that some of those figures absolutely are there.
Yeah, I think, it's funny because I had this odd anger against Joel Osteen for a while, and I didn't know where it was coming from.
Everyone hates Joel.
It really didn't, I was like, why do I even feel anything? That was like, where was that, those emotions even coming from? Why would I dislike him for anything? He doesn't affect my life in any way. And it came to me where I was realizing that I was really part of something bigger. I was hating him because it was part of a community of dislike of him. And I was like, wow,
yes, exactly.
I have to back up. I had to step a few steps back and be like, what good does he give in general, if it's possible? And then maybe say that if he doesn't affect me, then I can't think of him. And I saw the tweet earlier and I was like, you know what? Well, it doesn't make me feel like I want to like him, but it definitely makes me feel more positive. I bend towards at least he took the energy and the effort to do something of that. Yeah. So it's like, hey, my judgment on him had nothing to do with reality. So why was I even thinking of that in the first place? And seeing him actually take those actions should be admirable.
Yeah, and it seems like a fairly minor thing to do, big deal, Joel 10 years belatedly participates in a Black Lives Matter protest, and maybe he's just doing it cynically, but there's a heck of a lot of people within that world who would never think of doing that and who are influenced by that. So, one could also say, well, gee, it's just opportunism, but within American religious culture, there's always this mixture of guile and sincerity, always and everywhere. There's opportunism and there's sincerity, and they're frequently very, very intermixed. So it's difficult to say that it's absolutely this or it's absolutely that.
Right, and that's I actually then want to talk to you about our influencer in chief, who uses those symbolic items, like his photo op the other day, going to the church and holding the Bible. And to be honest, it was a hilarious moment, but it was really packed with a credible amount of violence in terms of what that means. Not just the violence of moving the protesters, but the actual violence. But I want to talk to you about his background. He like his role of like having like the influence of Norman Vincent Peale.
That's right. Absolutely true.
Like he's one of those people that this moment makes him, because Twitter is a moment for him. And so he's actually able to use the granular tool to the benefit of his presidency and become an influencer of sorts. So his reaction is the reactionaries. He's the king of that.
Yeah.
In more ways than just politics, like literally like with that. But that, it's interesting like to hear like that mindset he did. He built himself into that moment. And I can remember watching, I was upset, as you can imagine, of the election, but I remember watching the parade and his face. And I was like, for the first time I ever thought, he set his mind and he actually did it. And I was like, that's one of the first times I realized how much power there was in just making that happen.
Right, right. It's a very interesting question. And I wrestle with this question because I have written with critical sympathy of the New Thought movement, the positive mind, positive thinking movement. And it is undeniable that Norman Vincent Peale, author of the famous bestseller Power of Positive Thinking, which was the secret of the 1950s, it popularized these positive mind metaphysics. Peale was a singular influence on Trump. The Power of Positive Thinking may be the only book Trump has ever read. It's the only one he's ever talked about. And there's no question that it occupies a central place in his life. So it throws me back on the question, is there some intrinsic connection between a grotesque fraud like Trump and the positive mind movement? Now, if you ask somebody like Barbara Ehrenreich, Barbara would say, absolutely, absolutely. Here's this guy denying reality. He's a complete grotesque example of positive, what you call positive mind metaphysics run amok, because he's just saying the world is as I see it, and it's leading us down the road to destruction. There's no contesting that. There's no contesting that. The big question for me personally is there something intrinsically present in that? And I'm wrestling with that question. I could very easily give you an answer, no, there's no intrinsic connection, and I could defend that answer. But rather than defend that answer, I'm perfectly capable of doing that, and I'm perfectly capable of supplying counterexamples. I would prefer that people in the New Thought movement and people like me just at least hold that question and sit with that question. I have a vested interest in saying, oh, no, Trump is just an aberration, or there's no intrinsic connection. And I could defend that point of view, but rather than defend that point of view, I think it's better that I hold on to that. I hold on to that because this president is creating such a margin of division in our country that we're probably going to think of everything as pre-Trump and post-Trump.
Right.
It's disastrous. And I don't know whether we're going to recover from it. And I can't run and hide from the fact that the one book he's ever talked about was Power of Positive Thinking. So if it doesn't give me pause, shame on me.
So there's Trump himself in the background, like with his connection to Norman Vincent Peale, is like he went to the church. Like it obviously played played a large influence on his life. So it seems like I do agree, by the way, that I think it's probably his only book that he ever read, because
I think so.
I know one of his biographers, and he told the biographer that he doesn't read. He just simply doesn't. And that means I'd like to know if like maybe more about like how did that influence, like why did that become something that turned Trump into this grotesque figure? Is that
right? Well, it's interesting. I mean, Norman Vincent Peale was politically an extremely conservative figure, so much so that he probably crossed the line over to bigotry and nativism at a certain point in his life. He opposed the presidential candidacy of John F. Kennedy on the grounds that Kennedy, as a Catholic, would be loyal to the Vatican. I mean, this was ugly stuff. This was not just small town conservatism.
Right.
This was profoundly ugly stuff. And Fred Trump, Trump's wonderful father, took the family to Marble Collegiate on Fifth Avenue in New York City, where they attended church. And Trump was very taken with Peale, and Peale was very taken with him. Now, when I was writing my book, One Simple Idea, which is a history of the positive mind movement, I read a lot in there about Norman Vincent Peale, and I sort out his politics and his influences. Now, this book was written long before Trump's political career began, but Peale's successor at the time, a wonderful man named Arthur Caliandro, who's now dead, sat and spoke to me about Peale and his legacy and such. And Arthur, brilliant minister and a beautiful man, was critical of Peale in some very significant ways, even though he was seen as Peale's protege. And he told me, and I believe this in the book, he told me that Peale had a weakness for powerful people. He loved big, epic personalities.
Oh.
And he said once Trump was on television while Peale was still alive, this must have been maybe the 1980s or something, you know, back when Donald Trump was just a loudmouth real estate developer in New York City. Who knew? And he said that Peale stopped what he was doing and became very fixated on Trump on the television. And he found Trump a very appealing, magnetic figure. And Arthur said to me, you know, that was a weakness. That was a weakness. Peale loved rubbing shoulders with, hobnobbing with the big and the powerful. The poor may be blessed in spirit, but at Marble Collegiate, you know, the big shots got to sit in the front row, and Peale really grokked to having relationships with them. So it was a symbiosis, and it resulted in something I think really tragic and terrible, but it was a symbiosis. And I read about some of these things. Now, I must also say that there are aspects of Peale that I defend. You know, a lot of people don't realize this, but Peale in the 1930s was one of the people who helped destigmatize therapy, psychotherapy, going to see a psychiatrist. And Peale, with a psychiatrist named Smiley Blanton, co-founded a clinic in the basement of Marble Collegiate Church called the Religio-Psychiatric Clinic, and they provided both pastoral counseling and traditional, what was then traditional psychotherapy.
Right.
It was considered a terrible stigma to go see a psychiatrist in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. You know, you were thought to be off your rocker. People would keep it a secret. Peale helped destigmatize that. So again, you can't get at the truth of any of these figures' lives without understanding that there are all these paradoxes folded in upon one another. You know, in some respects, although Peale was conservative, very conservative politically, he was very liberal socially, because he helped strip away some of the shame that people associated with going to see a therapist. And he could write an article in Reader's Digest saying, you know, psychotherapy is as valuable to the personality as religion is to the soul, and nobody should be afraid of it. That was a brave stance. Yeah. And he did things like that at various times in his life. So I try to see the full man.
I like that. I like that approach. I think there's something about in Occult America, you write a lot about the histories of many people that were a little bit progressively ahead of their time, that normalized something that was further on, that they were fighting for, they were advocates of, that it seemed a little out, and then it became kind of normal. And they have to look at those moments, regardless of where they were coming from, as things that helped us progress, which is what.
Without question. I mean, there's a marriage between the spiritualist movement, or the movement around seances and talking to the dead, and the women's rights movement that's been so widely overlooked, and academia is just coming to grok to it and to understand it. But it's quite simple. In the mid-19th century, when the movement around spiritualism and seances began to sweep the country, who were the mediums? The mediums were women. And so women who wanted to have a voice in the culture, who certainly couldn't serve as civic or political or religious leaders openly, found their way to the seance table, and they became a religious leader of a certain sort. And there is such an incredible intricacy of connections and innate connections between spiritualism and suffragism. It really is a secret history, but it's a neglected history.
Yeah, I have just two or three more questions, and then we're going to send it to the audience, because I know they're aching to ask you questions too. One more political question, though, because it is relevant to this.
Yeah,
you mentioned about like the connection, or seeing people as something else. So I really want to talk to you about Bannon as the last thing. So Bannon, as he became the chief strategist of the White House, but he was a note reader of Julius Evola, and it seems almost, and we know now Bannon's worldview. Did he see Trump as a tool to exhibit that worldview from that occult-like background that helped him understand that Trump could be a tool for this output of the occult in that way?
That's a good question. I don't think I've ever put that question to him directly. So it's hard for me to answer in any definitive way. I first heard from Steve Bannon shortly after I published my first book, Occult America, in 2009. And he called me up and he was really grokking to it. He wasn't famous at that time. And he said, you probably don't know who I am, but I'm a conservative documentary filmmaker and an ex-financier. And, we became friendly. And it wasn't until years later that Steve's rise began. And when it began, it unfolded in a period of 18 months. There was a period of time where nobody had heard of Steve. And, he was this guy who lived in Santa Monica, conservative politics, made a lot of money by investing in the show Seinfeld, and wanted to bring high standards of quality to conservative documentary filmmaking, was into a whole wide range of esoteric figures, which is what got him interested in Occult America, among other things. And so we hit it off. And then I remember years later, I started seeing his name show up in the newspaper and news reports. And within a period of 18 months, he went from being this not well-known conservative activist to becoming a household name. He's this sort of intellectual Rasputin. And so now whole books are being written about Steve, right, and whole documentaries by talented people are being made about Steve. And it all transpired within about 18 months. I don't know, what he saw in Trump. I suppose he saw him as a vehicle for some kind of right-wing populism, although it's difficult for me to define right-wing populism, sure, because for me, populism also means that you have to protect the rights of working people, including with healthcare and so on, which I feel very strongly about. We don't talk politics, and we haven't talked much recently. I heard from him literally just the other day. There was a book he wanted to send me. What he saw in Trump, I'm not sure. But what Trump is an unmitigated disaster. Mm-hmm. And I can't say that plainly enough.
Yeah, as you can imagine, I agree with you. So I want to, just before we go over to questions, I just want to praise you a little bit with not to plug everything else, but I want to praise the ideas of the times you do talks with other people. And I want to bring up your most recent visit with Duncan Trussell, or visit. This is, and it's in the same way. We really wanted to have you in. This is supposed to be a salon series. We're supposed to be in public, but obviously the pandemic this is our best moment at this point. And honestly, if you have the time and we're in the city again, after we've got a vaccine and things are going somewhat back to a place where we can move forward from this, because there's no way going back to normal.
That's right.
We'd love to have you in person.
I'd be delighted. Yeah.
So I just wanted to bring up a moment that in that podcast that I listened to several times about some ways in which our mindset and being positive in this moment, like how it can affect us. So in a very short story, I went through a very, very difficult time at my previous job, and I turned down tenure. I had to do it because I was getting to this point where I could not be. I noticed something, that the place itself, regardless if I stayed, no matter how much I worked on my brain, it wouldn't have actually exhibited any way of moving.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true.
I was doing meditation, and this is something that was in this podcast, and my friends didn't believe me. They were like, okay, they were really skeptical because it wasn't working. I may have been doing it and feeling better personally, but I still wasn't exhibiting a better person out. And you mentioned that sometimes we realize we don't have to stay in those places, that we actually have that choice. And so that, when I listened to the podcast and I heard you talk about the changing in the venue, if you could just explain that to our audience a bit about what that means to think about how we have so much control as well, not just in our brains, but in our place, in our environment too.
Absolutely. I really hope this is useful to your viewers and your listeners. I think it's profoundly important. We live in such an overwhelmingly therapeutic culture, which is positive in many respects, that we internalize all of these messages without necessarily examining them. One of the messages is that you can't change other people, so you have to change yourself. You can't work on the rest of the world. You have to work on yourself. It's easier to wear slippers than it is to carpet the world. I borrowed that from Stuart Smalley. And that the problem is not some kind of exterior thing. The problem is that, you have to adjust your reactions, adjust your point of view, pray, meditate, think positive things about the other individual, all kinds of things. And I submit that sometimes that advice is simply wrong. Sometimes what the individual needs most urgently is to get away from cruel people, get away from people who are tormenting you, who are hostile to you, or who you just have zero chemistry with, and you're always going to have friction. And I feel that we underestimate the power of very simple things sometimes. And of course, with this lockdown, people have been cooped up together, sometimes in domestic situations that they're very unhappy in. And I feel that very deeply for such people. And some people say to me, look, you prescribe burning your bridges, you prescribe cutting the cord and not looking back. But some people say, listen, I'm in a financial situation where I can't do that. I'm in a family situation, employment situation, and I honor that. What I would say is vow internally, and mean it with all your life that you're going to get away from this person within and without at the first physical opportunity, and do so, because a change of venue, a change of neighborhood, a change of relationships, a change of employment can work wonders. And I don't say that lightly, or I don't say that as a figure of speech. It can make all the difference. It can save your life. Don't be persuaded that you always have to follow the imperative that all change has to occur within. There are changes that must occur with your feet.
Yeah, and thank you for that, because it was such a moment. It was so many elements of problems that I finally realized, there was no matter how much I stayed, there was no changing somebody else. So
absolutely no changing.
But I have the privilege of changing the venue, and that was like, holy crap! Like
I could tell you felt great when you did it. That last day you walked out and you thought, wow,
it was like that thing that
I'm throwing my coffee cup in the garbage and I'm gone.
It was that therapeutic moment of where that commercial, the dark cloud, is like walked away, and I was like, that actually worked.
It does work. It does work,
as you can imagine. But
it's not that I want to push one approach versus another approach, or say this is right, this is wrong, but just verify these things. We hear things repeated so frequently to ourselves, whether so-called spiritual truths or so-called therapeutic truths. We don't question them. And you're entirely at liberty to question whatever you want.
I thank you. Let's have somebody, I think we have a two-part question here. Joe Sinopoli asks, if we presume that Trump is acting in perennial values, is the ilk of Goddard, Peele, etc., that he's truly believing his words to such a degree that they feel real, even implicitly, does it then follow that he's manifesting his reality over our own? In a strange way, is he ruling our world via the noosphere?
That's a wonderful question. And I agree with the presumption of that question. I agree. And I think the answer is yes. But the reason I'm able to say that is, and this will be part of our part 2 discussion, I take a metaphysical view of life. I do believe that we have an extra physical existence, and I feel very strongly about that, and I feel I can speak to that very, very plainly and in ways that are not just metaphorical. That being the case, at least from my point of view, yes, I think Trump's assertion of reality is extremely powerful. But if that's an intrinsic part of every human personality, then it stands to reason that another individual can do the same thing. Mm-hmm. So becoming aware of this metaphysical aspect of your existence, I think, just broadens your sense of potential power, the importance of personal ethics, the tools that you may have available to you. If it's an intrinsic part of life, as I suppose, then it's available to everybody. And the guy in the White House is just dauntingly powerful at using it. How will you, the viewer, use it? That's an open question.
Yeah, I think it's an important observation too, to have that type of exhibiting that reality. I think that's something you did mention in the other podcast too, is like how much our extra physical senses are really part of us. So when we could tune into those feelings, because he's got every platform that exists. So it's like we are tuning in to that feeling. That we have to remember that we have that. We are that too. It's just, we may not have the platforming, but we do have that power. So it is. I love that observation.
And turning points can occur very quickly as well. I said Steve Bannon went from being a, not really well-known conservative activist to being a household name in 18 months. Things can change very quickly in any number of directions.
Yep. That's incredible. Kay Marin asks, can you speak to how or if occultist influence have helped growing acceptance of the mental health movement?
Well, it's an interesting question. So much of what we use today as our therapeutic language had its earliest entry point into Western culture through movements that could be considered occult. Today, we all talk about the unconscious mind, the subconscious mind, or, we all believe in, I think correctly, this notion that there is this other deeper mind that rules our lives in ways that go beyond ordinary above board cognition. Now, that's accepted by virtually everybody, I would think, today in the Western world. But the fact is, this notion of there being an unseen mind, a subconscious mind, this is much newer than we really think it is. And it was actually students of Franz Anton Mesmer, the occult healer who was active in Paris just before the French Revolution. His students began to think that perhaps the healings that he seemed to be working were not due to some invisible animal magnetism, which he claimed to manipulate, but rather that there was this other, deeper, unseen mind. And they began to theorize along these lines in the early 1800s. It wasn't until the 1890s that people like William James and Frederick Myers and some others began to speak of a subliminal mind, which later was referred to as a subconscious, which later still by Freud was referred to as the unconscious. But people are unaware of the fact that that concept is newer than we tend to think, and it began to enter Western culture through students of Franz Anton Mesmer, who was an occult figure.
Yeah, it was amazing to read your book, and actually not as a historian myself, a tech historian, it was amazing to hear how recent some of the terminologies even existed.
It's amazing. It's incredible. You'd think to yourself, this way of thought has always been with us. Just think positive and everything will work out okay. Well, if you said that to somebody, 150 years ago, they'd look at you, what are you talking about? This is fairly recent.
Right. Yeah, the late 19th and 20th century work that has been around, but now we had a language for it. And it's very interesting.
We make such a mistake in giving our history an older vintage than it really has. Someone wrote not long ago in the Washington Post that the New Thought movement was sweeping America in the mid-19th century. That's not true at all. The equivalent would be like saying rock and roll was sweeping America in the 1940s. You'd say, wait a minute, that's ridiculous. Of course, the roots of it were there. You had rhythm and blues and gospel and so forth. But we didn't start to see rock and roll until the 1950s with Fats Domino and Little Richard and so forth, and then later, of course, Elvis. So you got to really take a moment to reflect sometimes on how recent some of these things are.
That's like my big fear with tech history is that we use a lot of presentism with tech, and we assume that these things are around and everything's in their nascent fetus stage of technologies at this point, and we are just like assuming that this is just how life was. And so it is good to hear.
Wonderful point. Yeah,
this is part of a longer history that's very recent of how we speak about it today.
Yeah.
Brent asks, Mitch, can you talk about what we can expect from your recently published study guide on the Hermetic treatise of the Kybalion, if I'm pronouncing that right? Can you give us any personal anecdotes about how you engage in Hermes?
Oh, I really appreciate that question. I just published a Kybalion study guide. The Kybalion is an occult book that was published in 1908 under the mysterious byline of Three Initiates. And it really became one of the most popular underground books of the 20th century, and I would say of the 21st century. And a lot of people, upon first encountering the Kybalion, which purports to be a book of Hermetic wisdom, late ancient Greek Egyptian wisdom, and I was among them at one time, roll their eyes and say, oh, come on, this is just some early 20th century occult novelty, which is new thought or positive thinking, kind of dressed up in Egyptian style clothing. And I held that point of view, to a greater or lesser extent for several years. And then I realized I was wrong. I was just simply wrong. The fact is, the man who did write the Kybalion, whose name is William Walker Atkinson, who was a really prodigious and brilliant New Thought philosopher and publisher and a lawyer in the early 20th century, he was a sturdy student of Hermeticism. And using what Victorian age translations he possessed, he did codify some very solid Hermetic principles including psychological principles going back to a period where we had no conception of the psychological, apropos of the point you were just making about presentism, into the Kybalion. And I think the book is a real triumph, and it's become a very important book in my life. It's a good entry point to Hermeticism. And I would also recommend, as I do in the Kybalion Study Guide, reading traditional Hermetic texts, late ancient Hermetic texts, side by side with it. And our generation is very fortunate because Hermeticism was neglected for just generations following the Renaissance. It was considered discredited because the timeline was found to be wrong, and that these things were written down in late antiquity rather than primeval antiquity. And so there was a tendency over time to regard Hermetic works as kind of musty or fraudulent or something. That was just wrong. And for that reason, past generations didn't have good translations. We have good translations. So use them. I would read Hermetic works hand in hand with the Kybalion.
Awesome. Thank you. So another question coming up. Phantom Ocean asks, Mitch, I wanted to say thank you. Your article on sobriety was pivotal in me turning the corner and putting my own vices behind me and better focus on my own goals. Drew. I
appreciate that very much. He's talking about an article that I wrote, a Medium, called How Tucker Carlson Saved My Life. And why can't I stay away from the right wing? I don't know. Tucker and I were friends in when we were in our 20s. I don't know him, today, and we've long since lost contact. But he talked about he was on an interview show recently, and he said something to the effect of, just as an aside, he said, I wanted to be more successful, so I stopped drinking, and it worked. And I thought to myself, well, I am not abstinent. I am not sober, strictly speaking. But that is an approach to life that can be so valuable. And I did it, and I do go through periods of adopting sobriety when I feel I need to amp up what I'm doing in the world. Intoxicants are just, they can be very wonderful, and they can be very destructive. And it all depends upon the individual's experience. And we have to at least look at the possibility of going sober, going completely clean and straight, when it comes to intoxicants, if we want to be more effective in the world. It does have an impact. There's no question.
Thanks. That's very. Lori Johnson asks, I would like to hear your thoughts about meme magic, which really close to my heart. I'm a meme historian too, and its influence on the digital zeitgeist. Are these things reinforcing Trump's assertion of reality?
That's a great question. And in short, I would answer yes. I really do believe that is true. I believe meme magic just has an extraordinary capacity to interject, influence, spread an idea, an assumption across the culture, which is why it is so important in each of our individual lives that we stop to ask ourselves with great regularity, how do I know that's true? How do I know that's true? It's funny. The other day, Joe Biden made that gaffe about if you don't know the difference between me and Trump, you ain't black. And then later, he had to sort of walk it back and apologize. And there was a Republican congressman who said, a senator who said, well, shame on Biden, something like, 1.1 million black Americans voted for Trump. And I read that and I thought, that's interesting. Is that true? I have no idea whether that's true. I haven't the slightest idea whether that's true. America is a very large country, Are 1.1 million people even really that many people, And so I'm using a sort of example that just was on the tip of my tongue, but it's just one of these times where you have to ask yourself politically, socially, but also intimately, how do I know that's true? Because we all come under the enchantment of these things.
Yeah, just because I know what it is and you know what it is, what is meme magic?
It's the idea of usually a visual bit of information combined with a phrase, some unit of information that just gets put out into the culture and that we all automatically accept. Like an example, I don't know why I'm using so many political examples. People used to make fun of Al Gore for saying that he invented the internet. He never said that. We all know he never said that, but it was constantly pinned on him. You invented the internet. You invented the internet. And these things become so powerful. It's a kind of groupthink, but I think it's something more than groupthink because it's just so overwhelming.
Yeah, Luke got that question.
It's Tinder. It's Tinder to fire.
Yeah, it is. It's Luke and I and Josh. We all talk about this a lot, and it is my study in cyber cultures in the late '80s. There's a lot of Terence McKenna meme magic
That's heavy.
The time too.
That's
so
heavy.
Interesting to see these cycles as they come back into our present as well.
Yeah.
Stephen Brent asks, do you find value in the alchemical model of psychology and personal development as a way to introduce deep inner working concepts to the general public?
Oh, I definitely do. I can't say that psychological alchemy has been at the very forefront of what I've been involved with, but at the same time, this idea of turning gross matter into fine matter on a psychological level runs through the Kybalion. It actually runs through Hermeticism to a very great extent. Some of our late ancient ancestors from whom we're separated by just hundreds and hundreds of years and cultures and perceptions, nonetheless, they were interested in this quality of inner refinement, the idea that you could bring to thought, emotion, psyche, intuition, a finer, more developed quality, which in their mind would actually open you up to influences from a higher sphere. They saw life as composed of all these concentric spheres. And we, men and women, occupy one sphere. We're in sort of a disadvantageous position in this one sphere. We have these frail bodies, we decay, we die. But there are these other spheres where there's greater resiliency, and the influences from these other spheres on a psychological level, they wouldn't have thought in those terms. They might have said on a level of the soul or nous, or what we would call the psyche, some amalgam of everything that exists within the inner life can be refined. So you find that within Hermeticism. And I do think that you could refer to all that as psychological alchemy. And certainly some of the alchemists working in the Renaissance saw it that way, although again, we didn't have the term psychology or psychological. But I think there was a grasp of that. And I think that can be worked with by the individual in today's therapeutic culture for sure.
I agree. Scott asks, can you ask
Burbank, all right.
Yeah, Burbank asks, can you ask about having a spiritual practice in these dark times and what it is like?
The practice that I'm using right now, I mean, I have a variety of different practices that run through my life, and sometimes I'll bring one more to the forefront, one will become more pronounced. This is what I'm working with right now. I'm very interested in the idea of setting an intention, holding this intention, really making it the gravitational center of your existence, and watching very, very carefully. You must watch very carefully for signs of it concretizing in your world. And one of the things I'm working with right now is that we are often told that the royal road to using any kind of mind metaphysics or any kind of mental causation is sort of a feeling state. You have to enter into this feeling state where you feel possessed of that which you want. You feel emotionally persuaded of that which you want. And because we're living in a time where there is a great deal of anger, as you were alluding, and at all times,
Yeah.
Sometimes it's very difficult for the individual to enter that feeling state. So my question to myself and my question to everybody watching and listening is, well, if you can't enter the feeling state that allows you to feel fulfilled or forgiving or whatever it is you're interested in, what feeling state can you enter? What feeling state can you enter?
Wow.
Because maybe that's enough. Maybe that's enough to get where you want to go. Maybe you are unable to go to bed at night thinking, I'm wealthy. Maybe that's just an emotional impossibility, and that's understandable. But what feeling state can you enter? And that might be sufficient. I don't want us to hold ourselves to standards that make inner progress, outer progress impossible. I don't think a cruel trick has been played on us where unless you're, in this kind of fulfilled frame of mind, you won't receive anything. So there, that just kind of recreates this binary division between sin and salvation, let's say, that a lot of us fled from in the religions of our youth. So now that we're in a new place, let's not recreate that binary division in a new place. Maybe it's not necessary for you to go all the way over to the concept of prosperity, but maybe there's some other feeling you could have that's still constructive and powerful, and that's totally cool. Live with that, work with that, see what occurs.
Thank you. We in respect to your time, we got one or two more questions.
Sure, pleasure.
I've gotten, Emily Collins asks, I've gotten a lot out of the Kybalion, but I've never read it side by side with older Hermetic texts. I love this idea. Do you have any older Hermetic text recommendations for beginners?
Yes, for sure. And I love that question. Thank you. Because I think in a very programmatic way. So, so dig this. The Corpus Hermeticum was a collection of Hermetic texts that was translated from Greek into Latin during the Renaissance age. Get a good translation of the Corpus Hermeticum, and I'll recommend two. Read books 1 and 11. Books 1 and 11. They're very short. I mean, they're the length of what we would call pamphlets. And within those two books, you'll get a great encapsulation of some of the ideas that play out through the Kybalion. My personal favorite translation is from Cambridge University Press by a scholar named Brian Copenhagen. Cambridge University Press, Brian Copenhagen, 1992. It's just called Hermetica. It's magisterial. The publisher Inner Traditions also published a very, very good translation called The Way of Hermes, which came out in 2001. Both are excellent. I have a particular love for Copenhagen because he writes a wonderful historical introduction, and there are others to choose from nowadays. But it used to be people in the earlier generations, pre-Copenhagen, PC, they didn't have really quality translations to choose from. We do, so we should really take advantage of that. And there's others out there, and take your pick. But those two I think are especially good, and I would start with books 1 and 11.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure we put those in the show notes too. So thank you. And May Galzona asks, are there any or know of intriguing emerging trends in magical practice, i.e. incorporating tech or programming linguistics?
That's really interesting. I'm not much of a tech prophet. My friend Eric Davis is a much better tech prophet than I am, and he's a better person to whom to direct that question. I would say there are a few things that I see developing right now. One of the things I see developing is a willingness to really, really throw out all forms of orthodoxy, even the orthodoxies that we within the alternative spiritual culture have created for ourselves. I'm definitely seeing a more radical openness to questioning. And I'm excited by it because I found that I started to feel about 5 years ago that our responses to questions or concerns or problems that people were having, whether within ceremonial magic, whether within New Thought, whether within Wicca, all started seeming to come down to the same kind of catechism. There seemed to be a lot of rehearsed thought going on. And maybe just because of the frustrations people are feeling, I'm seeing that get really busted up. And I applaud that. And I call it anarchic magic. And I have an article titled Anarchic Magic that is up at Medium. And I just really want people to feel at liberty to take a sledgehammer to these old ideas. I wrote a piece which caused some ire recently called Forgiveness, a Descent, where I asked myself, how do we know? How do ethical individuals know? And by ethical, I mean respecting reciprocity. How do we know that forgiveness is such a moral imperative? That's been handed down to us. And I'm really honestly asking that question. And I want us to start asking those questions. And I think we are seeing that in the spiritual culture. I find that hugely exciting.
That forgiveness essay was absolutely incredible too.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We'll wrap it up. Luke says, "Where does Mitch get his leather jackets from?"
Oh, well, this leather jacket.
Always wondered.
This leather jacket is very special.
Wow, look at the lining in that thing.
What's that?
I see the lining in there.
Yeah, it was just restored, this lining. This leather jacket was purchased at a thrift store in the neighborhood of Dumbo in Brooklyn about a year ago for a television reel that I was doing, which you'll hear more about in the future. And I fell in love with it. I was just supposed to be renting it as a prop, but I loved it, so I bought it. And it was kind of falling apart. So very recently, I had this new lining put into it. And at first, I didn't like it, because it's too small on me, and I couldn't close it. And I said to my manager, I can't wear that. I can't close it. And he said, do you know that the Ramones could not close their jackets? And I was like, done. I will never complain again. Yeah. So that's where this one comes from.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's a good comparison, the Ramones and you. That's amazing. So thank you so much for being
Pleasure.
here. Do you want to add any plugs or talk about something before we close up? We could add them to our show notes or anything.
No, I really dug all the questions. I love the questions. I love everything everybody was asking about. I have a new book called The Miracle Habits, which is coming out in July, I think July 14th. In that book, I expand on a number of the things that we talked about, including the importance of radical questioning, radical verification. You may find, more important than anything else, you may find that an idea that you've been taught to internalize, even in settings that are considered very freeing and very progressive, may not be nourishing you, and you are allowed to discard it. And I want everybody to feel that liberty.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll definitely be checking that out, obviously. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who's here and all the questions. And we really appreciate your attendance. So thank you again, and have a very wonderful night, and be healthy and well.
Thank you. See you all soon.